Peace, everybody. I want to respond to the negativity and backlash I received for my part 2 video responding to Cynthia G and the divest black movement. And I want to clarify a few things, and I want to end this because I'm tired of talking about it. Men historically and routinely are the ones who establish perspective, who establish philosophy. And the philosophy is the way we conduct ourselves, the way we live, the things we believe, and how we relate to the world and ourselves. Some philosophies are vile and violent, like barbarians. Some philosophies are more civil, like allegedly America, the United States Constitution, which actually, it does actually say you got to be civil and everybody has rights, but the people who practice the philosophy in America don't really believe that. They did genocide, they killed, they murdered, they put people in slavery. So, but usually, men are the ones who actually establish society and establish philosophy. And the philosophy that actually is accepted are from the men who actually fought wars and went through trials and tribulations and displayed courage and valor, inhuman courage and valor. So the philosophies of these brave, courageous people are usually the philosophies that everybody seems to accept. Like Jesus Christ, they say he gave his life, he did something miraculous, and now his philosophy is permeating all over the earth. You have Prophet Muhammad, his philosophy, Islam. You have allegedly democracy. Now you have, democracy, so-called Revolutionary War that fought against monarchies, wanted to give freedom to everybody, allegedly. But in reality, the United States Constitution actually is Native American Iroquois. Thomas Jefferson adopted it and plagiarized it. But because the dominant philosophy in America is associated and attributed to the Caucasian male, and the war that they allegedly fought to bring this philosophy is attributed to the Caucasian male, then the so-called black women is assuming that the Caucasian male is the alpha male, because the philosophy that people adopt and a person who actually fought the war to bring that philosophy into existence is the alpha male. But she says the black man is weak. He's not the alpha male. She want to be with the alpha male. She got with the alpha male, alleged alpha male, the white man, 50 years ago. Since the 1970s, the so-called black women joined the women's liberation movement led by white women. They've been marrying, breeding, actually longer than 50 years ago, but for the past 50 years, the so-called black women really separated themselves from the black community. Fast forward to 2021, they seems to be very upset and dissatisfied with the choices they made. And now they're blaming their choices on the so-called black man. Because what the world realizes is the so-called black man in America, particularly in America, are still establishing philosophies. We have the Nation of Islam. It's an independent philosophy that people follow, led by Elijah Muhammad, Minister Louis Farrakhan, and whatnot. We have the Moore Science Temple. We have the Garvey Movement, United Negro Improvement Association. We have the Booker T. Washington. Even the Black Greeks was established by a so-called Negro by the name of Du Bois, Uncle Tom. Martin Luther King. Like, even right now, we have a 20-year-old rapper by the name of Kodak Black, who somehow was able to convince the president of the United States to give him a pardon. 20-something years old. Like, how many 20-year-old Caucasians or anybody of any other ethnicity is sitting down with world leaders getting them pardons or getting them to act? This is what the so-called black man is doing. And if the so-called black man is still establishing philosophies right now that people follow, that means the so-called black man is the alpha male. the one who actually leads the world with thought and behavior. Now the black man, the black woman sees this, and I think they're regretting abandoning the so-called black man 50 years ago. And they're saying they're divesting their support, and they're blaming every ill that happens on the so-called. The black man is the reason Black Wall Street was destroyed. The so-called black man is the reason that Fred Hampton was killed. It wasn't J. Edgar Hoover. It wasn't the FBI. You know, the black man is the reason for the millions of abortions that the white men, the black women have been getting. Like, the black man is the reason the black businesses doesn't exist. Like, everything that you could think of, the so-called black woman is blaming the so-called black man for. She gives no blame to the government. We have an entire government aimed and united against us as so-called black men. And we have the so-called black women against us. And we have the Mexican. We have everybody on earth united against the so-called black man, which makes us alleged victims, but we get no type of sympathy. We just to blame for everything. Now, the so-called black women, they don't want to take a responsibility for the choices they made. They're trying to impose what they call economic sanctions. Divesting something is a sanction. And when you impose economic sanctions, this is what countries do to other countries to get that the other country that they're imposing the sanctions on to comply with whatever that will they have. You know, whatever the obligation is. We're going to pull resources from you, and we're going to convince our allies not to support you. That's just a sanction. And by us not supporting you, it's going to cause you economic harm, which will mess your economy up, which will compel the people to force you to comply. But since the so-called black male don't really have an economy, we have nothing. You're sanctioning us, pulling your so-called divestment, which actually insinuates that there is actual something you can pull away, which is a so-called investment that you don't have nothing invested. So you can't really threaten us with a sanction, but allegedly you're trying to actually use an economic war tactic to convince so-called black men to do what exactly? What exactly do you want the black man to do? What are your list of demands? You're just on there complaining and whining. And the reason you're complaining and whining, because you know your tactics and your complaints are going on deaf ears. Because for one, the so-called black men don't supposed to exist. If you basically look at any group of people on earth, even the so-called Jews, after World War II, imagine if the so-called Jewish women aligned themselves with the Nazis against the Jewish men. Do you think the Jews would exist right now? But somehow the so-called black man is still existing and still have success. You could say we're going to convince our allies, the black women could say, we're going to divest in you, which was what the so-called black people in Chicago did to convince South Africa to end apartheid in the 90s and the 80s. They convinced Illinois and other states to divest in South Africa, which hurt their economy. And they convinced their allies to do the same thing. And that's the reason that South Africa gave up apartheid. It wasn't because efforts by the South African people. But if the black women say, if they convince Zaddy, their ally, to not give black men jobs, to not give us business loans, like these are terms of sanctions, to not assist us economically. I mean, they don't do that anyway. The few jobs that black men do have in America are jobs that are essential to that business existence. Say, for instance, LeBron James. If they somehow want to get rid of LeBron James, that might end the NBA. Like, when you find a so-called black man at corporate America or any institution that they don't run, that person is totally crucial to that organization's survival. They don't just give black men jobs just because, like they do with white people. They just got people sitting around at a cubicle doing nothing. Like, they don't give us jobs like that. And that one black man that they do hire is responsible for the work of 5 or 10 people. So they're going to extract as much from you as possible. You're getting paid as one person, yet you're doing the work of 10 people. Now, this is similar to something I read in this book years ago called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. In Invisible Man, the main character, who was unnamed, he went to New York, Harlem, and he got a job at a paint factory. And this paint factory was solely dependent on this black man. This black man was the only one that knew how to make the paint at the proper pressures, right? And it's an old black man, and this is the 1940s. So what you can deduce from that is this paint company must have at one point been a black-owned company, and the Caucasians must have took the company over, but they never learned how to make the paint. So they had to keep this old black man there just to make the paint. But what they tried to do, they tried to send a young, the protagonist of the story, the unknown character, they tried to send him in there to get the method of making the paint. And the old black man knew what they was doing. So he sabotaged the young man and blew him up a little bit. You know, the pressure was in his face. He ended up in a hospital. But, you know, they don't just give so-called black men positions just because. So if you threatening whatever sanction, whatever leverage you have with your allies to hurt us economically, they can't really do it because they don't really have nothing. They haven't really given us anything to threaten other than what they given us that they really actually need. Just like hold on, my whole thing as far as the so-called alpha male and a black man. Hold on, give me 1 second. And when I was talking about how the alpha male is the one who actually fights the wars. Can you help me? Regular. It's $3.99. Thank you.
Keep blowing the horn. Why is the gate's not open? It says waiting for a gate.
All right, you gotta wait.
What the hell are you gonna go on a couple of
Now the so-called black women, they assume that the so-called white man is the alpha male because history gives the credit of fighting the wars and establishing the philosophies to the so-called white man. But if you really look at every war that was successful, including the so-called American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, but the only war that we lost was the Vietnam War, and that was because the black men in America was fed up with the turbulent 60s. We didn't have no rights in America, yet you want us to go and fight for this country in Vietnam. So that's the one war we lost. And we won the Gulf War, 1991. And that was because the leader of the war was General Colin Powell, a black man. He said we got to get in and get out. We can't occupy this people. Get in, get out, get the job done, secure the oil, whatever. Let Saddam live. You know, you don't kill a king, you let him live, and put sanctions on him. So that was a war that was won. The last war was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Obama got in there after Bush because they had a prolonged, protracted war. And Obama actually expanded the war and wanted to occupy the entire world. And when they did that, when the army was tied up in all these countries, this is the reason Africa was able to acquire power and start the AU under Gaddafi. And this is the reason Mugabe was able to get independence from the British, because the United States had no real threat. The British had no threat because they was tied up in Iraq and in the Middle East. Now, Trump tried to reverse that, pulled the army out so they could be able to be sent whatever they wanted. They could be a threat in the world. You can't be a threat in the world if you tied up. So now, so-called Biden put another so-called black man over the army because the so-called black man is the reason for this country's freedom. The one who actually leads victorious wars and success. And this is the so-called alpha male. But the so-called black woman really abandoned the so-called black race thinking they was gonna get with the Caucasian male, and they was gonna achieve something. They was gonna accomplish something. And I guess whatever they thought they was going to accomplish didn't come about. They wanted to help. They wanted this so-called zaddy to lead them to prosperity. But reality, and I know this personally, a lot of these black women, they be taking care of these zaddies, like Serena Williams, Holly Berry. They get with the zaddy, and they gotta be the one to work. I know a regular old hood rat was taking care of a white man. She working, slaving at a hotel, while the zaddy was laying in the house doing nothing. So they looking disappointed at their choice in getting with zaddy. It hasn't been successful, and now they're venting their frustrations and blaming me for their problems. But the reality is this, and this is the reason I just remember I wanted to use this parable before I get up out of here. I'm over here in this car wash. But the so-called black man has to learn from history. And the best history we can learn from is the Bible. And there's a story in the Bible, a whole chapter in the Bible called the Book of Esther. And in the Book of Esther, it dealt with the Persians. It was after the Babylonian captivity, and when the children of Israel was in Persia, and they was allowed to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. But in this particular story of Esther, it was a king by the name of Ahasuerus. He wanted to impress his advisors. He wanted his wife to come out and impress his advisors, and his wife wouldn't do it. She embarrassed him in front of his advisors, and his advisors told him, hold on, I know it's real loud. His advisors told him, you gotta get rid of her. You gotta get rid of her. You gotta get you a new wife. Because if you let your wife get away with this, our wives gonna do the same to us. Hold on. He said our wives gonna do the same thing to us. Our wives do the same thing to us. So King Ahasuerus, his advisors told him to sign a decree that every man must rule his household first, and he had to actually choose a new wife. But they couldn't just choose anybody; it had to be a virgin, whatever. So they started a pageant, a contest to decide who's going to be the new wife of Persia. Make a long story short, Esther won the pageant, and she was one of the children of Israel. She wasn't even a Persian, and she was able to become the queen of Israel. And because she became queen of Israel, she was able to get inside information as far as what the government was planning. And the enemies of Mordecai was Esther's uncle. They was planning on getting the king to sign a decree to kill all the children of Israel. And she found out about it and told Mordecai. And Mordecai told her to convince the king not to do it. And she did that. She convinced the king of Persia not to kill all the children of Israel. And then the king ended up killing the enemies of Mordecai. But to make a long story short, the woman that we choose to be a companion with, it doesn't matter what that particular nation is, because the nation actually comes from the men. It doesn't really come from the woman. And you see that with the king of Persia. He chose one of the children of Israel to be the queen of Persia. He didn't even choose a Persian. So the black women, they think that they have leverage in affecting, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish actually. Are they trying to affect the behavior, the philosophy, the mentality? Are they trying to get the black man to do what? I don't know what they want the black man to do, but if you just really abandon a group of people for 50 years and you put nothing into that person's development, and you want to jump up and feel that you have rights to that person's accomplishments or culture or whatever, when you haven't put nothing into it? Where does that happen? You know, where in the world do you just get to benefit off of the dividends of something that you didn't really invest in? You know, they made a choice to not invest nothing into the so-called average black man for 50 years. And a lot of them moved on, you know. Like, you know, you got a lot of so-called, like the black woman on that group was trying to say Drake wasn't a black man because his father's a Jamaican and his mother's a Jew. And they say they don't want to even accept the children of black men that didn't even come out of black women. Even though in America it always been a one-drop rule. If you got one drop of black blood, you black. See, the black woman is out their minds. I don't know what's going on with them. Their anger. But they have to analyze their own self and change their own ways, because they really don't have any leverage at this point. You can't just go 50 years hoping that Zaddy was going to help you and bring this prosperity to you. And since it has failed, you're going to come back to something you abandoned 50 years ago? Like, in reality, I know this video is kind of long, but I can't think of not one black woman that ever helped me do anything in my life. But it was one, but this particular one wasn't even from America. This was like a Liberian. But from a black woman in America have never helped me do anything. So how can they claim any type of anything from if I had success? How can they feel obligated to anything I have if they didn't invest anything in it? You know? It doesn't work that way. You got to be there when a person didn't have success in order to try to lay claim to their success. You can't wait for a person to blow up and then jump in when you don't even have principles, really. You don't really have like morality. You don't really offer anything of value other than just your physical body. And that hit the wall eventually. And when that hit the wall, then what? You just a bag of flesh on YouTube complaining about something that you didn't really, you know, contribute to. I don't know. That's about it, though. I just want to add something.